Nearly half of transgender and non-binary youth seriously considered ending their life last year. Not over a lifetime, in a single year. Today, we're asking why, and more importantly, what we can do about it. I'm Mike Doherty, and today on Cracking the Shell, Joey and I sit down with Dr. Ethan Marish, psychologist, researcher, and director of the Lavender Lab at the University of Maryland, to talk about LGBTQ+ mental health, minority stress, and what the science actually tells us about the suicide crisis, and the resilience on the other side of it. Before we begin, this episode discusses suicide and discrimination. If you're in crisis, call or text 988 or reach out to the Trevor Project at 1-866-488-7386. Now, on with the show.
We cracking that shell now. Abby, Ben, Mike, Joey, let's go. Yeah. Cracking the shell on the mic, psychological science in sight. Abby bringing that fire sparks when she speaks, ignition on sight. Been with the breakdown, mind state takedown, never miss the details. Mike hitting concepts heavy like freight trains on steel rails. Joey steady mapping brainwaves, decoding how we feel. They turn that abstract real. Yeah, the knowledge is real. They peel it back slow, layer after layer. Mind so deep, yeah, we ride that elevator.
Welcome back to Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. I'm Mike.
And I'm Joey. In our episode with NAMI Maryland, we highlighted the mental health rates here in Maryland. But today, we're going to take a deeper dive into mental health disparities with Dr. Ethan Marish, a licensed psychologist and faculty member here at Maryland. Ethan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mike and Joey. I'm glad to be here, and I'm so excited that you're continuing the thread from the NAMI Maryland conversation that you had. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about mental health needs of queer and trans people.
So, Ethan, tell us about the Lavender Lab, its mission, and what you're trying to understand.
The primary goal of our work is to understand health inequities or health disparities that LGBTQ people experience, particularly adolescents and young adults. We also take an intersectional focus. We look at LGBTQ people who are also Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I'll use the term QT BIPOC throughout our conversation, which is queer, trans, BIPOC people. So broadly, we focus on suicide, substance use, and other health outcomes, and try to understand why those inequities exist. So we focus on oppression-based stressors and how those create risk for those negative health outcomes. We also are committed to the other side of the coin, which is around resilience and resistance. And so we ask questions like what helps people flourish despite these pressures and stressors, what protective factors exist, and we're trying to also identify interventions that can help promote resilience and resistance.
So let's get into the numbers on suicide, because I think a lot of people underestimate how high they are. A 2023 CDC study found that roughly 1 in 5 youth consider suicide, and nearly 1 in 10 actually attempt it. Those numbers are stark. But how do they compare to LGBTQ+ youth?
They are stark, and the picture is even more stark and awful. And when we think about it for LGBTQ youth specifically, so for example, the Trevor Project, which runs a helpline for LGBTQ young people, they do research as well. In their 2024 national survey, they found that 40% of LGBTQ young people seriously considered suicide in the past year. If we think about for trans and non-binary youth specifically, that number climbs up to almost 50%, 46%. So rates of suicide ideation, thinking about suicide, are high, and also suicide attempts are much higher than heterosexual and cisgender populations.
I'm struck by the differences between the general population and those of trans and non-binary youth. Those are quite significant differences.
That's right, yeah. And those have been actually widely documented now for at least more than 2 decades, and those rates have not decreased either. And these gaps can't be explained by individual factors alone, and they're often actually explained by some theoretical frameworks like the minority stress theory, as well as other oppression-based theories. So minority stress theory was developed by Dr. Brooks and later on by Dr. Meyer, and at the core idea of this theory is that stigmatized group experience chronic excess stress that is unique to their minority identities. So this isn't just ordinary everyday stressors, but these stressors related to discrimination, harassment, and having internalized oppression, as well as the having to navigate unsafe spaces and having to conceal one's identity. All of those stressors add up over time and accumulate and create real damage in terms of mental and physical health, which then fundamentally leads to suicide risk.
So your work adds another layer, intersectionality. What happens when someone is both LGBTQ+ and a person of color?
And before you answer that, do you mind defining the term intersectionality? This was something that was new to me, say 3 or 4 years ago. So, maybe our listeners would benefit from that definition.
Intersectionality theory was developed by Black feminist scholars. Broadly, it's thinking about we all have intersecting identities. We all have a gender. We all have a sexual identity. We all have a race. We have abilities and disabilities. We have many other social identities and positions. But the core point of the theory is that our identities interact with systems of oppression like racism, heterosexism, cissexism, ableism, and so forth. And those systems inflict harm and stress on especially minoritized or oppressed groups, but also some of those systems provide privilege for advantaged groups. So thinking about the person within their context, within systems of oppression.
So when someone has multiple identities, how do those add up in the way they experience both the oppression, but also the consequences, the mental health consequences of those identities?
They don't necessarily add up. From an intersectionality perspective, they interact. They intersect rather than sort of they're summed together. So an example of that, the Trevor project data show that LGBTQ youth of color report higher suicide rates than their white peers across every racial group. And Native and Indigenous youth specifically had the highest rates at 22%, followed by multiracial youth at 17%, Black youth at 16%, and Latina youth at 15%, where white youth were reported at around 11%. This is an intersectional finding in that we can think about how racism and heterosexism and cissexism interact to inflict harm and stress for these BIPOC groups. Here it comes out in terms of suicide.
Can we dive in a little bit more on this topic of suicide? So in your 2023 paper in the Archives of Suicide Research, you looked at outness and suicidality. What did you find in that paper?
The short answer is that being out can be both protective as well as a risk factor depending on your age and environment. So what we found is for younger adolescents, so the sample was all LGBTQ adolescents or young youth, and for the younger participants in our sample, being out or coming out was related to more suicidality. So it was related to, in some ways, more vulnerability. Where for the older youth in the sample who are LGBTQ, being out was related to less suicidality. So it was an aspect of it that was protective or affirming. What we learned from that is being out is a complex issue, and our ultimate goal is we want the environments to be safe and affirming for people to come out and be embraced rather than oppressed.
So family comes up a lot in this context. NAMI Maryland talked about family support as a key protective factor, but for LGBTQ plus youth, it's more complicated.
Yeah, it's enormously complicated and enormously important. So family rejection is one of the most potent risk factors for LGBTQ mental health and particularly suicidality. So for example, in the 2024 Trevor project data, fewer than 40% of trans and non-binary youth reported living in a gender-affirming home. So when a younger person's primary attachment figures are the source of rejection, stress, that creates a lot of distress and relational ruptures for those individuals. Related to that, the other side of the coin is having affirming social supports, affirming parents is dramatically protective. We regularly find that in the literature for decades now, having a supportive family member or hopefully parents or broader family is related to less suicidality, less depression, and substance use. So families play a really important role in here and are especially important in preventing suicide and poor mental health.
You just mentioned substance use, and this is another major strand of your work. So why is it so tightly linked to suicide risk in this population?
Both substance use and suicide are linked from kind of similar roots around minority stress or oppression-based stress more broadly. So if people are experiencing oppression, chronic discrimination, hopelessness, substance use can serve a way to regulate those painful emotions or manage them or as a way to regulate these painful emotions or numb out. And we see that in the literature as well. So recent CDC report from 2023 data show that LGBTQ high school students were about twice as likely to misuse prescription opioids as their peers. We've also published experimental work where we had participants who were LGBTQ young adults view stimuli that was discriminatory, so heterosexist stimuli, so not directly directly experiencing it, but vicariously being exposed to oppression, elicited alcohol, nicotine, and cannabis craving among those individuals who use those substances. So just really highlighting that exposure to oppression is a significant risk factor for both suicide and substance use.
And your 2025 paper in LGBT health looked at this intersection of race, sexual identity, and drinking specifically, right?
We did a study with a large sample of QT BIPOC adolescents and across the country, and we found that experiencing these intersecting forms of oppression, experiencing racism, heterosexism, and cissexism simultaneously was related to more poor outcomes when it came to alcohol use. Specifically, what we found is experiencing these microaggressions and stressors led to drinking to cope motives, so wanting to drink to cope with distressing emotions, and then that ultimately led to more hazardous drinking. So it became a chain: oppression, coping motives, to drinking to cope specifically, and then harm, hazardous drinking.
Ethan, let's talk about what actually helps here. So resilience is central to your work. What's the role of resilience or building resilience in protecting people from these negative outcomes?
It's so important, and it's honestly one of the most meaningful parts of my work is to be able to focus on resilience and resistance among QT BIPOC populations, especially given the field tends to have a very pathology-focused approach. So looking at what's wrong, and which is important to document disparities, but also and looking at bad things like stressors. At the same time, there's a lot of good things that are happening, a lot of strengths that exist among LGBTQ and BIPOC communities that are often overlooked. So, for example, looking at sources of pride, strength, joy are important. So, for example, we published a qualitative daily diary study in 2024 called Queer and Trans Joy, where we asked LGBTQ adolescents every day for 21 days to tell us about positive experiences, joyful experiences that they had related to their LGBTQ identity. What came from that is really rich findings around feeling affirmed, feeling a sense of authenticity, a deep connection to the community, as well as others that are affirming, brought joy to our participants. So those were important aspects of experiencing joy or having positive identity experiences. And those existed at multiple levels. So participants reported feeling joyful about being able to explore their identity affirmatively, talk about it with peers, teachers, their parents in an affirming way, and as well as going to community spaces for example, in their schools, like gender sexuality alliances, or even having being exposed to positive or affirming social media content or news reports brought them a lot of joy, which is an important part that would buffer against oppression.
So for clinicians who aren't in specialized LGBTQ plus settings, what does affirming care actually look like?
Yeah, an important part of it is taking a cultural humility approach and cultural competence and humility specifically approach and educating oneself. And an important part is start by not assuming. So not assuming someone's identity, pronouns, relationship structures, or family configurations. Allow clients to tell you about their lives and learn about their experience and how they describe it. And so part of that is also using inclusive language in your paperwork, websites, and other intake materials, and how you set up your practice in terms of if it's a virtual or in-person practice. What cues are you communicating that this is a safe and affirming space where clients can talk about their identities in a way where they'll feel affirmed and heard and believed. The other part of it is also about educating yourself on the impacts of oppression, being able to assess that with your clients and help them understand how that impacts their well-being. And then lastly is also knowing your limits. If you don't know something, that's okay. That's part of cultural humility, is we know what we don't know and acknowledge it, and seeking consultation and supervision where appropriate.
Ethan, as we close, what do you most want listeners to take away, whether they're LGBTQ plus themselves or love someone who is?
I love that question. So I'd say three things. I'd say first, to LGBTQ listeners out there, if you're distressed or feeling upset, this is not a personal failure. It's not something to be ashamed of. This is a predictable and intentional response to genuinely difficult circumstances, especially systems of oppression that are designed to make you feel this way. The second is to allies, family members, teachers, friends, and others, is that affirmation really matters, and it's life-saving. So really invite you to create affirming spaces and relationships with LGBTQ people in your life. And that really means is giving them unconditional love. And then lastly is If you are someone who is struggling right now, is reach out to others for help. And if you can't find someone to reach out to, call a helpline. So you can call 988, which is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can call or text. If you're an LGBTQ young person, contact the Trevor Project, which is specifically for LGBTQ young people. You can call or text them also at 1-866-488-7386. You can also contact the Trans Lifeline if you're trans or non-binary at 877-565-8860. And if you want more resources, you can go to my lab's website, thelavenderlab.com.
All of those resources are in the show notes. Well, Dr. Moresh, thank you. This was exactly what our listeners needed to hear.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed chatting with both of you.
Ethan, thanks for sharing your time with us today. We hope we can have you back, maybe for an update on some of your research.
I would love to.
That's it for this episode of Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. Until next time, I'm Mike.
And I'm Joey.
Cracking the shell where the neurons hum. Synapses sparking like a beating drum. In the labyrinth of the mind we dwell. Stories of science we're here to tell. From the brain to the heart we explore the art of humans, of creatures.
Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science is a joint production from Abby Nicholas, Ben Jones, Joey Burnett, and me, Mike Doherty. We also want to credit Anthropic's Claude and Suno AI for their help behind the scenes today. If this episode resonated with you, help us grow by subscribing and sharing. These are the types of conversations that need to reach more people. If you have ideas for future episodes or just want to say hi, email us at crackingtheshellonpsychology@gmail.com. That's one long shell-cracking word at gmail.com. Until next time, keep thinking, keep learning, and keep showing up for the people around you.
Crows with puzzles, dolphins with grace, rats running mazes in a timed race, children growing, their minds take flight, development sparks in the dead of night, chemicals swirling a cocktail of thought. Why do we feel and why do we not? Mirror neurons reflecting, empathy's call, the science of psyche, it binds us all.